Reading has multiple definitions. Some might define reading as getting meaning from texts. Certainly, someone who's able to read should be able to get meaning from text. That's the purpose of reading. But for my purposes, that's not the definition of reading. Reading is a skill. It's the ability to call the written words on a page. It's the translation of written symbols into audible oral expression. There are two ways to teach people to read English. English can be taught phonetically by showing students that letters and groups of letters stands for certain sounds. These groups of sound-bearing symbols make syllables, which make words. Ideation. This is pronounced ideation. The other way that reading is taught in English is by sight. This method teaches students to memorize whole words. With this method, many words are taught as sight words in the early grades. Students are shown words and they memorize those words. Instead of seeing groups of letters that make syllables, they simply see and say the whole word. Ideation. This is not really reading, but it allows students to seem to read. So, how does memorizing allow students to read or seem to read? Well, most texts in English only use a limited number of words. In her book, The Hidden Story, Geraldine Rogers estimates that the 2,000 most commonly used words make up about 95% of the words written in most English paragraphs. So if students memorize a certain number of sight words, they can read most passages, and then the words that they don't know, they can guess using the context. But memorizing words and then guessing the words you don't know is not what I call reading. They seem to read the text, but it's not the same as understanding phonetically how to read. Now, very few Americans today were taught to read purely by phonics. Most were taught to read almost solely by sight, with some supplemental phonics. This is true for myself, and it causes me some problems reading to this day. Fortunately, my mother taught me to read before I started school, before I started kindergarten, and she taught me with her own home brand of phonics. Now, it's easy to tell how someone was taught to read. There are a couple of quick tests. I'm going to go over some that I think are kind of cool with you that can allow you to evaluate someone's reading ability and to tell whether that person was taught to read phonetically or taught to read by sight. And so the first test I'm going to show you is a flashcard test. And I want you to play along with me. So these is just like sight words. Now I'm going to do the first couple with you, and I will say them out loud with you. And after that, I'm going to keep flashing the cards, and I want you to say out loud what the word is, even though I'm not speaking along with you. All right, you ready? Okay. Stop. Blue. Never. All right, your turn. Wait, did you just say silver? I thought you said this one was silver. Now maybe you didn't. Maybe you got it correct. If so, good job. You were probably taught to read phonetically. But a lot of you, if you actually followed along and played the game, a lot of you on that first word, probably when you saw the word sliver, you said silver. And the reason is, you've been taught to read by sight. You're trying to see the whole word at once and take it all in, and that's what came to your mind. But if you read phonetically and you read left to right, S-L-I is different than S-I-L, and you won't make that mistake, sliver, silver. Now, when I have students make this kind of mistake in reading that I'm working with them, one of the things I'll ask them to do when they read a word incorrectly is to spell the word. When they spell the word, it forces them to look at the letters from left to right, and then usually, if they have any supplemental phonics, they'll get the correct thing. But you may see that you made that mistake. If you didn't, great, but that's a real common mistake that people make. It's a real easy test to see if people read phonetically or if they read by sight. Now I want to talk about a couple other tests, okay? So the next test I want to talk about, I just call the Old Testament genealogy test, okay? If you've ever read in the Bible, there are places in the Old Testament where it lists lots of names, and this person begat that person. A lot of those names are weird, and they're not the easiest names to say. They're not names that we're familiar with. Some people, when they get there, they just completely shut down. Now, I won't say that I necessarily read it the way that it's meant to be pronounced in the original language, but you should be able to look at words that are unusual and say what they would say, even if you don't do so perfectly. So, in Mahalalel, oh look, I messed it up, okay? Lived 65 years, and he begat Jared. So a lot of people, when they see this, they just shut down. But if you're reading phonetically, Mahalalel, or in English, you might sometimes blend the two E's, Mahalalel. So either way would be an acceptable pronunciation. But the main thing is, you don't just shut down. That as you're reading, when you come to those unfamiliar words, you can just go through and hopefully not have to slow down and be too conscious about it. You should be able to do this almost unconsciously. Now, when the word is really unfamiliar, you may have to make a little bit more of a conscious effort. But I see a lot of people who are taught to read by sight, and they get to the names and they're just like, I can't say that, which tells me that they've learned to read by sight instead of learning to read by sound, instead of learning to read by phonics. So another test that I want to do real quick is called the Jabberwocky test. And some of you may be familiar with Lewis Carroll's poem, The Jabberwocky. And the Jabberwocky comes along in Alice in Wonderland. It's a little poem, okay? But it's a poem that's made of nonsense words. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves and the mome wrasse outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird and shun the frumious Bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tumtum tree and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galloping back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, Callooh Callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome wrasse outgrabe. So the thing about this test is, one, it comes up in a story. Two, though, it's words that aren't really words, so you can't have memorized them. So if you learn to read by sight, you're probably going to have difficulty with this. If you can read through there and not slow down and just say the sounds, then you understand how to read phonetically. It's a good test that I sometimes use when I'm dealing with older kids and I don't want to go back to a very basic reading test to make them feel lesser, so that they can still look at this and see that they have some trouble, so then we can work on phonics. Now, all students should be taught to read phonetically. This is the way that they really learn to read. If students can read phonetically, they won't balk at Jabberwocky or biblical genealogies, and they won't mistake sliver for silver. Now, how can we test if students can read? And here again, I mean reading as a skill is being able to call the words. I do not mean reading comprehension. I will have another video shortly on reading comprehension tests and what they really test. One way to test if students can read is to have a list of words with no context and to have the students read those words one at a time. Pretend your oral reading test has 100 words. You can then just mark if the students read the word correctly or incorrectly. Since there are 100 words on the hypothetical test, the number of words that the students read correctly is his score as a percentage. And this is a true test of skill, reading skill, being able to read orally. Another way would be to have the students read a passage aloud and mark each word that is read incorrectly as the student reads. Again, a percentage can quickly be found by taking the number of words that the student read correctly by the total number of words in the passage. Now, Geraldine Rogers, in her book that I showed you earlier, made an important note about testing a skill. If you're testing a skill with people that don't have the skill, say people who haven't been taught to read in this case, the scores will pile up around 0. Once they've been taught the skill, their scores should cluster around 100. So let me explain that just a little bit. So if you had kindergartners coming in, most of whom have not been taught to read, if you were to give them a score, they had 100 words to read and you marked how many they read correctly, most of the students would get 0. Now, if they had parents that read to them at home or they'd seen words, maybe they picked up a few words like cat or dog, or to quote Dr. Seuss, little words like if and it. And so maybe some of them would get 2 or 3 words or 3 or 4 words. And you may have a few kids whose parents actually taught them a little bit of phonics or did a little more reading, and they may score a little bit higher. But out here on this far end, you're going to have almost nobody. So before the students have the skill, all of the scores are going to cluster around 0 on the low end of the score. Now, when you start teaching students to read, whether you teach them phonetically or you teach them by sight words, their scores are going to go up. So if you're teaching someone with phonics, they will probably learn words with short vowel sounds first, and they'll start moving from 0 and they'll start moving up. They'll be able to read words like red and bed and fad, okay? And they'll start to go up along the way. Now, if you're teaching someone with sight words and they start to memorize, maybe with those high frequency words at first, again, if those words show up on the test as they start to memorize, their score will go up. Well, then later, if you teach more phonics, you learn the long vowel sound, the score should go up higher. And then you learn unusual combinations of letters that aren't the typical, like IGH being I or TION being pronounced shun, and the score starts to go up. And by the time you finish teaching a student phonetically, the student should be scoring at or near 100% on a test like this. Now, if you keep going through sight words and you get through a certain number of sight words, maybe the students with their controlled vocabulary in their reading books or the things that they've been introduced, they've learned 500, 1,000 words, and if most of the words on your 100-word reading test come from those, their scores will go up. In fact, if it covers just those high frequency words, their scores should also go to 100. But if you have a test that has unusual words or different words, words that aren't on their sight reading list, that haven't been in their controlled vocabulary in their reading books, these students aren't going to be able to pronounce those words. So while their score will go up, they really won't get all the way to 100%. But someone who's taught with phonics, even words that they haven't seen, you know, most elementary schoolers aren't going to know the word ideation, but they should be able to read, to pronounce the word ideation, because they've got the phonetic ability to do so. So their reading score will go toward 100. And the good thing about this is when they're reading in passages, if they can say the word in context without having to think about how to say the word, then they can learn the word. They can add to their vocabulary by reading. But if they can't say the word, they may figure out what it means by the context, but they don't know what the word is, so they won't remember it later. They got the meaning for the passage so they could read by context, but they have no idea what the word ideation means. They can't even say it. So you've got to teach them to be able to say the words. But when they learn that, most of the scores should start to cluster around 100, and you'll have some fewer scores that are lower that haven't mastered the skill yet. But if you're testing a skill and you get a bell-shaped curve, a bell distribution, you're either not testing a skill at all, or you're testing students that are in the middle of learning the skill, because before they learn the skill, their scores should all be on the low end, or mostly on the low end, and after they've learned the skill, their scores should all be on the high end. You should not get a bell-shaped distribution if you're really testing a skill. Now, the last thing that I want to say be able to truly read any word, even unfamiliar words, students have to know phonics. Teach your kids phonics. Now, I know a lot of people, comprehension is an issue. That's really where we want to go with reading. We want students to be able to comprehend. To be able to comprehend, they have to know the words. And the best way to know the words is to be able to say any word, even words that you don't know, by being able to do so phonetically. Once we can do that, we can work on comprehension, but we're going to see that comprehension is not a skill. Okay, comprehension is based on innate intelligence and background knowledge, and that will be the subject of my next video.